I'm glad to be here today and excited to participate in this program. I think the TED Talks are exciting, and so when they came with big questions, the question that was posed to me, I said, that sounds good. It came from my book, and I said that it should be either a difficult, let's see, there we go. There's a short and a long answer to whether or not affirmative action is still necessary. So I pondered over the reasons what I should do, and I said, should I take the short or should I take the long way? And I said, well, I think the best way to do it, because this is a TED Talk and it's short, is just to do the short answer. And so the short answer is yes. Thank you very much. But if we get into it a little bit more, what I would say is that what is affirmative action about? Well, we have a lot of assumptions about what it is, and today I'm going to talk about none of those assumptions, because what I argue is that affirmative action is not about affirmative action. I argue that affirmative action we think that it's about something that's deep and meaningful, and it is, but it's not really what we think it is. Affirmative action has a lot of different things for us to think about, and before I get into the meat of it, I want to take you through a little process. As I was exploring the concept of affirmative action, I said, well, what are people arguing about? And what it came down to is that you had two sides that were arguing basically about the same things. And I said, if they're arguing both for the same things, talking about equality and access and things of that nature, then what is it that what is the debate's about? And so I really couldn't get at it, and no one really had the answer for me after I read lots and lots of books. And so I came up with this concept called the shell core embedded conflict theory. Now, the shell core embedded conflict theory, you see all this nice, long, pretty stuff? Let's skip that. It's really about this. This is a walnut and the shell and the nuts inside. The reality of it is that you cannot get to understanding affirmative action until you understand that most debates in society, and this is what I argue, this is what the core of this debate is, I say that the shell core embedded conflict theory states that most social conflict emerges from divergent interpretations of core societal values and beliefs. That's what all that long stuff said. But the reality of it is that we think that it means much more than that. So going back here, we never get to the core. We spend so much time talking about the shell. We spend so much time talking about who gets what they should get, why they should get it, why this person and that person shouldn't get things and why I should, that we never get to the core. And I say, well, why don't we get to the core? Is because social sciences and the media has us confused about things. And I think that we as experts, that is, we supposedly are experts, we say that we're experts, we're told that we're experts once we get degrees and so on and so forth. So we present ourselves as experts, but actually maybe we're not as experts as we think because we haven't been able to solve the problems. If we were able to solve the problems that are presented to us, then maybe we would be experts. But we haven't solved those problems yet because we're still focusing on what? The shell. So we spend all this time, money, energy, and effort focusing on something that's only an external understanding of something that has a much deeper meaning. Now, what do I call that the deeper meaning is focusing on? Well, I suggest that it's focusing on liberty, equality, and justice. Some folks say, well, if we look back at Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, you know, we talk about, is this what affirmative action is about? Or here you have, it's a funny comic that came up on a black commentator. It says, affirmative action. And then they have a persistent state of vegetative state. So it's saying, it's suggesting that this is racial dichotomy, and that in the racial dichotomy that you have somebody who's not, there's no change going on. There's nothing that's being resolved for it. Well, before I get to her, what I want to suggest to you is that we have to think about things differently. We have to come up with a new conceptualization about how we understand and how we approach the concept of affirmative action. But really approach the concepts of liberty, equality, and justice. Because if you look at it, both sides in the affirmative action debate are talking about how do we get a more equal society? How do we come with a more just reality so that we have access to the things that, that we feel as though we're entitled to? Well, each side is right, but they have divergent ideas about how you get there, have divergent ideas about what really conflict is, or not conflict, but what really equality is. And so we have got to come to a place where we develop a new understanding, develop a new debate about those things. And so I spend the time in my book on the Hidden Debate talking about how do we get there. I don't, as a matter of fact, I use the book in class and students say, well, you didn't actually tell us what equality and liberty and justice are. I said, actually, you're right, that's the next book. But in the process, the reason I didn't, though, is that because part of that is that we have to have, in society, a discussion. We fear talking about liberty, equality, and justice. In fact, if you look at most social scientists, the writing for social scientists, we don't talk about any of those things. The majority of the books that we talk about in terms of equality and justice and freedom or liberty, we talk about the opposites, right? You have 1,000 books on inequality, but how many books do you really have on equality? You have a plethora of books on injustice, but how many actually talk about justice? You have all kinds of books that talk about oppression, but not too many talk about freedom. Now let a person who's in finance try to tell you about becoming wealthy, but all they talk about is poverty. You'll never get there, right? You can't become a millionaire if somebody who is poor and doesn't have money is telling you their solution for gaining wealth, because you need that foundation, you need the connection. And so what I'm trying to get us to do is to get a connection with that. Here's Shirley Whiter, a former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor, says the outcomes of voting in Michigan affirmative action, because remember the big affirmative action debate that went on in Michigan, there was a referendum, and it says the initiative underscores the fact that race continues to matter in America. The oppression of the opposition to affirmative action increases when racial minorities are viewed as the primary beneficiaries. When white women are added to the mix, there is less opposition. Ironically, white women have been the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action. Interestingly enough, right, and I'm not getting ready to get into statistics because that's not the point of the discussion. We want to talk about the meats and bones of it. We want to get to the core. We spend time on the surface because that's a good place to argue. Oh, this person there's 20 over here, there's 30 over here. But what do you really want? What does it really mean to get to the next place? What does it mean to transform the reality that we're in the middle of? How do you get to a place where it's not just about how many students are sitting here in the classes at Seton Hall, but that the outcome of what they do once they leave here is something that's transformative? How do you transform those realities is that we have to transform the mindset. I have an example that I use, and I say that the reason that we can't transform our realities is because we don't see the embedded nature of the problem. Here's a great example. If, for instance, all the parties in the affirmative action debate, their hands had been hermetically sealed to a lit match, and that lit match was sitting up here, and this board up here represented the sun. They couldn't see the sun, they couldn't see the match, because the sun burns so bright you can't see it. If you you do this example yourself. Go take a match, hold it up to the sun, and see if you can see it burning or not. But I bet you if you hold it long enough, what'll happen? You'll burn yourself, right? And so what I'm suggesting to you is that we in society are going to get burned unless we do something different. We have to change our perspective. Now, if we turn to the side, and the people on the side who already see that the flame is lit, they have to be the ones who now can convince the people who are looking at the match in front of the flame, in front of the sun, that the match is actually lit, so that we begin to change our perspectives so that we can get to the point of transforming our realities. We need to transform our realities. The reason I use this quote is because here we have a perception about what affirmative action is and who the beneficiaries are, but in fact, most of the reality of it is that it's wrong. It's erroneous. If white women knew that they were the primary beneficiaries of it, would they be so averse to affirmative action? Good question. Another topic. Next person will ask that one. The Supreme Court, another joke on affirmative action. Affirmative action is okay as long as it's not too affirmative or too active. Right? So what do you end up with? And then as Strom Thorne said, I can live with that. But the reality is that that's not transformative. We have got to be transformative about it. Affirmative action as a social problem. What is the social problem of affirmative action? Or asked another way, in 2 or 3 words, what do affirmative action policies and programs intend to address? And what I argue is that they intend to address is confusion. And they intend to address confusion in part, and don't get me wrong, that's not that I'm saying that it's not needed. I think that it's definitely needed, but I think that we need to transform how we position our understanding of what it is. And so then I come up with this, that these core principles, liberty, equality, and justice, are interrelated principles. And until we get to the place where we understand that they're interrelated, that we have to have a debate on them, what equality is, what liberty is, and how justice is acquired, and how we maintain them. There's two ways that these principles relate to each other. There's a negative and a positive relationship between these principles. The negative relationship is represented in the outer circle. The positive relationships is represented in the triangle and the inside. As the positive relationships between liberty, equality, and justice are improved, you have improved social relationships. That is, that we can work together better once we understand each other better. If we don't have a better way of understanding each other, then it gets further. And if I had the types of graphics that I would love to do, that the circle would expand as the negative elements of affirmative, or rather these core principles, is their interrelationship pushes us further apart, but the triangle pulls them closer together. So if you could see that, imagine that, that as we transform the reality and the social conditions, that this circle would get smaller and smaller, and thereby we would have a better way of interrelating with one another. Now it says up here that inequality leads to injustice, lack of freedom is unjust, and inequality impedes freedom. So I put freedom at the top because I see freedom as a key element in the liberty or freedom. I use the words interchangeably. There's some debate about whether or not they can be used that way, but I take the liberty to use them interchangeably. Now, in the process of this, though, we have to understand that when you see each one of these, when people try to suggest to you that you could talk about them independently, I suggest you leave the room. It's like looking at the concepts of liberty, equality, and justice, or looking at race, class, and gender. You have lots of scholars who've talked about the fact that race, class, and gender, looking at them independently, is a way to misrepresent the understanding of how they work, because they're so interrelated. The same is true about liberty, equality, and justice. So if we're going to transform the realities of the society in which we live, if we're going to have affirmative action actually mean something, then we need to look at them from a basis from how liberty, equality, and justice work together. And since none of the sociologists and economists or anybody else talked about these, the psychologists talked about them in ways that were meaningful, I went to the philosophers. And so I used a kind of a sociology of philosophy to get to understanding each of these concepts. And I listened to Rawls and all these different concepts, and each one of them brought something meaningful to the table. And the things that they brought to the table that were useful to me was that we need to come up with a holistic way of approaching it. So that holistic way of approaching it has 2 points to it. One is that we can't just look at it the way that our educational institutions suggest that we do. That is that as a sociologist, I'm told that the more I learn about sociology, the better things that I do, the more educated I become as a sociologist, the more and the more narrow my focus, the more I'm celebrated, right? So if I write more and more books on race and in a narrower fashion, covering that area, and I become a better expert, I'll be called by the media more than I am. I'll be asked to come and speak places more and more. But I say that's erroneous. That's the problem. What we really need to do is to be more holistic. We need to have, as the ancient Kemites would say, that we need to have a way, or Egyptians as the Greeks called them, we need to have another way of understanding and looking at it so that we understood that it's not just about any one thing, but it's about all those things collectively. We have to have a sociological, a psychological, an economic, a cultural, a spiritual. All these different models need to fit into the understanding of it, because if we don't understand culture, how do we resolve differences within individuals and groups? We need to see how culture fits into our social models, how it fits into our psychological models. So then there's 3 words I want us to think about as I end, and that is worldview, perspective, and transformation. I've talked about them already, but I think that if we really focus on those 3 things, that if we understand that we've got to see that there's different worldviews, different ways that different groups of folks see the world and they experience the world. But we need to get them to change their perspective. Looking back at the sun, if they change their gaze away from the sun, they can see that the flame is lit, and that would transform our reality, and then we wouldn't be burned. Thank you.